Sunday mornings always feel sacred in our town. Sunlight streaming through the stained glass, painting our little church in colors too beautiful to seem real. I sat beside Matthew, hands folded neatly on my lap, smiling when others smiled, singing when they sang. To anyone watching, we looked perfect, the kind of couple people envied for our calm, our unity. But as Father Bennett spoke about truth and sin, something inside me shifted. It was small, like the flicker of a candle in a breeze. I didn't know why, but the word betrayal made my heart tighten. I kept my eyes on the altar, trying to focus on the sermon, but it was like every verse found its way straight to me. "Truth will set you free," the priest said, and I almost laughed. Free from what, though? I brushed the thought aside, pretending to pray, pretending not to notice how heavy Matthew's silence had become beside me. He didn't look guilty. He looked bored. And somehow, that bothered me even more. When the Mass ended, the whole congregation poured out into the sun, full of warmth and chatter. I was still smiling, still performing, when a teenage boy ran past us holding a camera, saying Channel 4 was airing their weekend city report. I nudged Matthew playfully. "Maybe we'll see someone we know," I joked. He smirked, too quickly. "You and your curiosity," he said. But there was something in that smirk, something off, that made the air between us colder than the church marble floors. That afternoon, the house felt unusually still. I made lunch the way I always did, a little too much seasoning, a little too much care, because that's what wives do when they're trying to fill the silence. Matthew was in the backyard, pretending to trim the hedge while humming off-key, and I tried to pretend too. Pretend that we were fine. Pretend that the strange weight in my chest was just Sunday restlessness. The TV murmured in the background, a comforting hum that helped drown out my thoughts. Then I heard it, the reporter's cheerful tone cutting through the air. "And here we see couples enjoying the sunny weather downtown." I turned toward the screen, wiping my hands on a dish towel, barely paying attention, until I saw him. My heart stopped. Matthew, my husband, walking hand in hand with another woman, smiling like the sun itself had chosen him. Their fingers were intertwined, their laughter so easy, so familiar, that my knees nearly gave out. The fork slipped from my hand, clattering against the plate like a gunshot. For a second, I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, grasping at explanations that didn't exist. He said he was at a work meeting. That's what he told me, while I packed his lunch and kissed his cheek. I stood there, frozen, watching the betrayal replay on screen. Not a rumor, not a suspicion, but a broadcast. Public, undeniable, and cruelly casual. The world saw it before I did. I just stood there, staring at the screen long after the segment ended. The reporter's voice faded, but that image, his hand on hers, stayed burned behind my eyes. Every sound in the house felt sharper, the clock ticking, the faint hiss from the stove, my own breath catching in my throat. It wasn't just anger I felt. It was disbelief, humiliation, and something far colder. The realization that the truth didn't whisper this time. It shouted, in front of everyone. I thought about every dinner we shared, every time he looked at me and lied with a smile. How many times had I been the fool in my own home? I wanted to scream, to throw the plate, to call the station and beg them to take it down. But instead, I did what women like me are taught to do. I stayed still. I cleaned the kitchen. I wiped the counter until my reflection looked calm again. Inside, though, a storm had already started. As sunlight slipped away and the room grew dim, I made a silent promise to myself. I wouldn't cry for him. Not yet. Not until he walked through that door, pretending nothing had happened. I'd let him hang himself with his own words. Because the thing about lies is, once they're on camera, they don't fade away. They play on repeat. And tomorrow, so would he. By the time Matthew's car pulled into the driveway, night had already folded itself around the house. I stood by the kitchen counter, arms crossed, pretending to check messages I wasn't reading. My pulse thudded in my throat as his whistle floated through the hallway, careless, tuneless, like a man with nothing to hide. When he walked in, smiling like everything was normal, something inside me hardened. I had rehearsed this moment a dozen times in my head, but the words still burned coming out. "Did you enjoy your meeting downtown yesterday?" I asked, my tone lighter than it felt. He didn't even flinch. "Yeah, it went well. Why?" he said, pouring himself a drink. I watched him stir the ice, casual as ever, and for a second, I almost admired the performance. "Because you looked very comfortable for a business meeting," I said. His hand froze midair. It was a beautiful, fleeting second, the moment he realized the stage lights were on. He tried to recover fast. "What are you talking about?" he asked, that smooth voice slipping just a little. I met his eyes, steady. "Channel 4, afternoon report. You and your colleague, walking hand in hand like newlyweds." The color drained from his face before he forced a smile. "You're overreacting. It was nothing." Nothing. That word echoed in my head, sharp as glass. I smiled back, but mine wasn't kind. "Holding hands is friendly now. Maybe I'll start with the mailman." He sighed, dragging a hand through his hair. That same gesture he always used when he wanted to look tired instead of guilty. "Caroline, please. Don't make a scene over something so innocent." Innocent. The word hit me like a slap. I looked at him, at the man who once swore he'd never hurt me, and wondered if he could even tell the difference between lies and love anymore. He was calm. Too calm. That's how cheaters survive. They make you doubt the fire you feel burning in your gut. I turned the TV on again, replaying the report just long enough for his laughter to fill the room. He stood there, speechless, staring at his own betrayal framed in pixels and daylight. "The entire town saw you," I said softly. "You made the scene yourself." He tried to speak, but nothing came. I could see the panic crawl up his throat, then sink just as fast. He thought I'd crumble, that I'd cry, that I'd forgive. Not this time. "I didn't humiliate you, Matthew," I whispered, stepping closer. "You did that all on your own. But you've taught me something valuable tonight." He blinked, confused, desperate for control. "Taught you what?" I smiled, leaning in so close he could feel how steady my voice was. "That some lessons are best learned in public." His mouth opened. No apology, just shock. And that's when I turned the TV off. Silence never sounded so powerful. He stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of every lie he'd ever told. I watched his face shift. Guilt, fear, arrogance, all flickering like bad reception. "You think this will just blow over?" he said finally, his voice breaking between pleading and pride. I tilted my head, almost pitying him. "You've already been forgiven too many times, Matthew. The next chapter isn't about forgiveness." He looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time, he seemed to see what I had become. Someone no longer afraid of the truth. He muttered something about fixing things, about privacy, about not letting people misunderstand. But it was too late for that. The town had seen the truth in high definition, and there was no rewinding live television. I just stood there, quiet, watching him crumble under the weight of his own exposure. I wasn't shouting. I wasn't crying. I was documenting. Storing every twitch, every tremor, every word for what would come next. Revenge doesn't always scream. Sometimes it studies. Before he went upstairs, he turned and tried one last line. "You'll regret embarrassing me." I almost laughed. "Oh, darling," I said, voice soft as a prayer. "You have no idea what embarrassment looks like yet. Then I turned off the lights and left him standing in the dark, the glow from the TV still reflecting his betrayal on the wall. That night, as I lay awake, I wasn't plotting. I was preparing. The difference is patience, and I had plenty of it. By morning, I was done crying over a man who didn't deserve my tears. What replaced the ache was something far more dangerous: clarity. I brewed my coffee slowly, watching the steam rise like smoke from the wreckage of what we'd built. There was a calm in me I couldn't explain. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't peace. It was purpose. I realized that if humiliation was going to be the story, then I deserved to write the next chapter myself. I drove to the local news station under the soft disguise of curiosity. I even rehearsed a smile in the rearview mirror, polite, warm, believable. The receptionist, a girl barely 20, lit up the moment she saw me. Mrs. Walker, your husband was in the clip yesterday. Everyone thought you two were adorable. I laughed lightly like I shared the joke. Yes, adorable, I said. I'd love a copy of that video, just for our family records. She didn't notice my hands trembling when she handed me the flash drive. When I got home, the walls felt too quiet. I plugged the drive in and pressed play. There he was again, Matthew, laughing in sunlight that now looked like mockery. I watched it twice, then a third time, until the sadness dissolved into steel. That's when the idea came. Revenge wouldn't be loud, it would be artful. I opened my laptop, imported the footage, and began editing. As the cursor blinked, so did my heartbeat, steady, sharp, and certain. I trimmed the clip carefully, each second chosen with purpose. I didn't need to exaggerate. The truth was damning enough. I overlaid the footage with white text that appeared softly on screen. While his wife thought he was working, the words floated like whispers, simple but merciless. Then I added screenshots of his messages from that same day. Running late, big meeting. A perfect contrast to his laughter in daylight. It wasn't rage fueling me anymore, it was precision. As I watched it play from start to finish, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time, I wasn't the victim of his choices. I was the editor of his downfall. It felt poetic, almost holy, to take what he'd done in public and turn it into justice. I didn't scream, didn't throw things, didn't seek comfort from anyone. I just sat there in silence, the glow of the monitor painting my face as I pressed export. The sound of progress bars had never felt so satisfying. By evening, the video was uploaded anonymously to our community's Facebook group, the same one where people shared bake sale photos and church announcements. I watched as the first reactions trickled in. Wait, isn't that Matthew Walker? Then came the comments, the shock, the whispers spreading like wildfire. Within an hour, the clip had hundreds of shares. I didn't reply to a single one. Justice doesn't need to speak. It just needs to be seen. By nightfall, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Friends, acquaintances, even old classmates were messaging me, all pretending to check in. I didn't answer any of them. I just scrolled, watching as the video spread through town like a storm no one saw coming. Every share, every comment, every gasp was a little spark of justice lighting up the darkness he'd left me in. For once, it wasn't my humiliation that was public. It was his. And it felt almost cleansing. I imagined him seeing it for the first time. That flash of panic, the dry throat, the desperate excuses forming before his brain could catch up. I could picture his boss forwarding the clip, his colleagues whispering in hallways, the woman beside him realizing she'd been filmed too. He had lived his lie under the sun, and now the sun was burning him back. It was poetic symmetry, the kind life rarely gives you. But I had made it myself. As I sat in the dim light of my living room, I thought of every woman who ever swallowed her pain in silence. Every wife who was told to be patient, to forgive, to stay. I wasn't staying. I was rewriting the ending, not with shouting or tears, but with evidence and intention. The whole town wanted a headline. I gave them one. And the best part? The story was still unfolding. Tomorrow he'd wake up to find out just how famous he'd become. The next morning, the house woke before I did. The sound of Matthew's frantic footsteps echoed through the hallway, drawers opening, doors slamming. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, texts, calls, notifications piling in like a flood. I didn't need to read them. I already knew. The video had exploded overnight. I got up slowly, made my bed, and listened to the chaos downstairs. He wasn't whistling anymore. His silence was louder than any confession he could ever give. When I walked into the kitchen, he was pale. The color drained right out of him, like someone had unplugged his soul. "Caroline, what did you do?" he asked, voice trembling. I poured myself coffee, steady as a surgeon. "Oh, did you go viral?" I said. "I haven't even checked my phone." He slammed his fist on the counter, eyes wild. "The whole town saw it. My boss called me. You humiliated me." I stirred the coffee, watching the swirl of sugar melt into black. "No, Matthew. I didn't film you." "You filmed yourself. I just gave you the audience." He looked at me, breathing hard, searching for the woman who used to forgive him. She wasn't there anymore. "You ruined me," he said, the words almost breaking. I took a slow sip, never looking away. "No," I answered softly. "You ruined us. I just made sure the credits rolled properly." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was thick, not with love, not with anger, but with the undeniable truth that the story was his, and the ending was mine to write. He started pacing, muttering things about damage control and reputation, like that could patch the hole he'd ripped through our lives. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me?" he said, his voice cracking between fury and panic. I almost smiled. "To you?" I asked. "You think betrayal ends in private, Matthew. You chose the stage." "I just opened the curtains." He didn't like that. His jaw clenched, veins tight along his neck. He looked smaller then. Not the confident man I married, but the coward he'd become. He reached for my arm, not hard, but enough to make me look up. "Caroline, stop this. We can fix it." His tone softened, desperate now. But the moment had passed, and the woman he'd known, the one who always mended what he broke, was gone. "You can't fix something you destroyed for sport," I said quietly. "And you didn't just betray me. You mocked me, publicly." He shook his head, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I never meant to humiliate you." I exhaled, almost pitying him. "Then maybe next time, you'll learn to keep your sins off camera." He stood still, speechless, surrounded by the ruins of his own pride. I grabbed my car keys from the counter, slipping on my coat with a calmness that unsettled him. "Where are you going?" he asked, voice trembling. "To breathe," I said. "Something I forgot how to do around you." As I reached the door, I turned once more. "You can keep your 15 minutes of fame, Matthew. I'll keep my dignity." The door clicked behind me, final and clean, like the last cut of a perfectly edited scene. I drove without a destination, windows down, letting the cold air sting my face. It felt like proof that I was still alive, that I hadn't been buried under the weight of his deceit. The streets were quiet, but I could feel the whispers floating through town like invisible smoke. Everyone knew. Every phone screen, every coffee shop conversation, every side glance belonged to us now. Or rather, to him. I had become a spectator to my own liberation, and it felt terrifyingly good. When I finally pulled over by the lake, I sat in silence, watching the ripples catch the early light. That's when I understood it. Revenge wasn't about rage or destruction. It was about balance, giving weight to what was taken. Matthew had turned love into theater. I had turned truth into broadcast. Maybe people would call me cruel, maybe dramatic, but no one would ever call me blind again. I breathed in deeply, and for the first time in years, the air didn't taste like lies. By the time I returned home, he was gone. His car, his clothes, even his cologne that used to linger in the hallway, all vanished. But he'd left something behind. Silence. A silence that didn't ache, didn't accuse, just peace. I stood in the doorway, looking at the empty space where his shoes used to be, and smiled faintly. "You wanted the world to see you," I whispered. "Now they can't unsee you." And somewhere deep down I knew this wasn't the end. It was the consequence he'd written himself. Days turned into weeks, and the scandal rippled through every corner of our small town. Matthew's name was whispered like a cautionary tale, the man who got caught on camera with someone who wasn't his wife. His coworkers laughed behind his back. His boss put him on leave for personal reasons. The woman from the video stopped answering his calls. Every time he tried to fix what he broke, the silence on the other end became his new punishment. For once, he couldn't talk his way out of the truth. I watched from a distance, not out of pity, but out of closure. It was strange seeing him fade, piece by piece, in the same community that once adored him. The man who thrived on control had lost it all, and I didn't have to lift another finger. Karma had simply pressed play. I no longer checked the gossip or cared who said what. What mattered was that I could finally sleep through the night without the sound of my own doubts echoing in my head. Freedom had a quiet rhythm, and I was learning its song. Then, one night, he showed up at the door, eyes red, voice trembling, a shadow of the man who once mocked my kindness. "Caroline, please, I lost everything. Can't we just start over?" he said. I looked at him, really looked, and felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, just the stillness that comes after a storm has spent itself. "Start over?" I asked softly. "Like you started your second life behind my back." His lips parted to argue, but the words died there. He knew I wasn't asking. I was ending. He tried to reach for my hand, but I stepped back. The space between us felt heavier than ever, filled with all the lies, excuses, and half-hearted apologies that could never bridge the distance he'd created. "I made a mistake," he whispered, like those words could erase the broadcast that exposed him. I shook my head slowly. "You made a choice, Matthew, and choices have audiences now." His eyes filled with regret, but even that looked rehearsed, like a scene he'd played too many times before. Only this time, I wasn't his co-star. I handed him a manila envelope from the counter. Smooth, deliberate, inevitable. Divorce papers. He stared at it like it was written in another language. "Caroline, we can fix this," he pleaded, voice breaking. "You forgave me before." I smiled faintly. "I forgave you when you were late for dinner. I forgave you when you forgot anniversaries. But this?" I took a breath, steady, unshaken. "You showed the world who you are. Now it's my turn to show them who I've become." His shoulders collapsed as the truth landed harder than any slap could. He sank into a chair, head in his hands, muttering my name like it still had power. But it didn't. Not anymore. I walked past him, picking up my bag, the sound of my heels echoing across the kitchen tile like punctuation marks. "Goodbye, Matthew," I said softly. He looked up, eyes wet, as if he finally realized the ending he'd earned. "You're making a mistake," he said weakly. I paused at the door, turning just enough for him to see my smile. "No, love. For once I'm correcting one." After he left, the house didn't feel empty. It felt honest. The silence that followed wasn't lonely. It was clean. like the first breath after a long dive underwater. I walked through each room, touching the furniture, the photos, the spaces that used to carry our laughter. It was strange how peace could feel so foreign at first. The same walls that once echoed arguments now stood still, listening. And I let them. Because silence, I realized, isn't the absence of love. It's the absence of lies. Over the next few weeks, the weight of him began to lift from my life in pieces. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since before the marriage. Color returned to my hands before it returned to my heart. Every brushstroke felt like reclaiming oxygen. People whispered, of course, about the scandal, the video, the divorce. But I didn't care. I had lived inside gossip once. Now I was living beyond it. And that was its own kind of justice. One afternoon, as I stood by the window watching the sun fall across the yard, I caught my reflection in the glass. I looked older, yes, but freer too. The kind of woman who had walked through humiliation and turned it into art. He had gone public with his betrayal, and I had answered in kind. But what came after wasn't revenge anymore. It was rebirth. I smiled softly, closing the curtains. Tomorrow I'd start again. Not as his wife, not as his victim, but as myself. Months later, I found myself sitting in a small cafe downtown, the same kind Matthew once loved to take her to. The irony wasn't lost on me. But this time, I wasn't hiding behind shame or heartbreak. I was sipping tea, sunlight warming my face, scrolling through my phone when a familiar logo caught my eye. Channel 4, the same news station that had once aired my humiliation. But the headline was different now. It read, "Local woman opens art studio, inspires others to rebuild after betrayal." The photo below showed me standing in front of my studio, paint on my hands, smiling like I'd finally made peace with the world, and with myself. I stared at it for a long moment, then laughed softly. I had become my own headline, and for once it wasn't about pain. It was about possibility. The same town that had once pitied me was now celebrating me. It was strange, beautiful, and maybe even a little funny, how life has a way of flipping its own script. My phone buzzed on the table, interrupting the calm. A message from an unknown number lit up the screen. "Caroline, I'm sorry. Please, can we talk?" I didn't need to read the name to know who it was. My fingers hovered for a second, but there was no anger left in me, just clarity. I typed my reply slowly. "The world already heard you talk, Matthew. I'm done listening." Then I hit send, placed the phone face down, and took another sip of tea, tasting peace instead of bitterness for the first time in years. As I looked around the cafe, I noticed the TV mounted on the wall, the midday local broadcast playing softly. The volume was low, but the captions were clear enough. Up next, the grand opening of Walker Studio, a story of resilience and new beginnings. My studio. My story. My name. I turned my gaze toward the screen, and there I was, smiling nervously beside my artwork, my hands shaking as I cut the ribbon. The same camera that once exposed my heartbreak now captured my healing. Full circle, perfectly poetic. People in the cafe started whispering. "That's her," someone said softly. But there was no judgment this time. Only admiration, a quiet respect. I felt the warmth of it wash over me. For years I had lived under the shadow of his choices. But now, every stroke of paint, every headline, every look from a stranger reminded me that my story didn't end with betrayal. It began with it. And for the first time, I didn't just survive the spotlight. I owned it. When the segment ended, the screen faded to black, and my reflection appeared again. Calm, older, but radiant in a way I hadn't seen before. I smiled to myself, whispering the truth I'd earned. He went public with his betrayal. I made sure his downfall was televised too. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of church bells, just like that Sunday morning. Only this time, there was no irony in the air, just freedom. And it was finally mine. That evening, I walked to my studio alone, long after the crowds had gone. The air smelled faintly of paint and rain, the scent of new beginnings. Canvases leaned against the walls, colors half dried, waiting for their stories to be finished. I ran my fingers along one painting, a woman standing beneath a storm, her umbrella gone, her face turned toward the rain. She wasn't hiding. She was enduring. And for the first time, I realized she wasn't just a painting. She was me. I sat in the middle of the room, surrounded by the quiet hum of everything I had built from ashes. No cameras, no whispers, no headlines. Just me and the sound of my own breathing. People think revenge is about destruction, but it's not. It's about restoration. Taking back the pieces of yourself someone tried to break. Matthew lost everything that day on camera. I, on the other hand, found something priceless. The truth of who I was before his lies began to define me. When I locked up for the night, the street outside was washed in soft light, the shop window reflecting my face like a second chance. I smiled, whispering a small prayer, not for him, but for me. For the courage to never dim myself again for someone else's comfort. As I walked away, the sign above the door caught my eye. Walker Studio. My name, still his last name, yes, but now it meant something different. A woman who took her pain public and turned it into art.